Hey, welcome to the Stand to Reason broadcast. Today, I'm your host, Alan Schliemann. Greg is off today, and so I'm going to be filling in for him. I'm one of the staff members here at Stand to Reason. I get to do a lot of speaking and writing and teaching, so I get to have a lot of fun here, and I enjoy it a lot. And today, what I'll be doing is answering some open mic questions that Greg has been, leaving for me. That are sort of related to my expertise, I guess. And so that's kind of the plan for this particular show. So we have some, we can just jump right in here and get started. The first question is a question from Randy about the Quran. So let's hear that question here.
Hey, Greg, Randy back calling. Been studying the manuscript evidence for the New Testament, and oftentimes comparisons are made to other great works from that era, and the comparison of the relatively low number of copies of manuscripts that I guess we have compared to the New Testament, which has a huge number, 5,800 at the last count, roughly. I was wondering if you ever heard or seen of a number for manuscript evidence for other holy books like the Quran. I was asked this by somebody that I was given a lesson to about it. I had not ever seen a number for the Quran. I just wondered if you've seen one, and hopefully it would be relatively low or not even existent. Thank you very much. Bye.
Yeah, thanks, Randy, for that call and that question. I guess the answer depends a little bit upon how you define ancient and how you define copies of the Quran. In other words, if you're just simply referring to manuscripts of the Quran that are within, let's say, the first 100 years or so, then I'm not an expert in the manuscript evidence for this, but I would say there's probably about a handful of manuscripts that date back to within 100 years of the Quran. Now, I'm going to mention some of the most important copies of the Quran that we have, some of these most important manuscripts that we have from that time in just a minute. But actually, I don't think the number of copies is perhaps the most interesting aspect of the available data that we have about the Quran. Rather, I think what's more interesting, and I will answer your question, but rather I think what's more interesting is the kind of claim that Muslims make about the Quran and how that's very different than the kind of claim that Christians make about the Bible. So when you think about Christianity, what Christians say about the Bible is that it is the inspired Word of God. In other words, the doctrine of inspiration says that the Holy Spirit, who is God, inspired human authors to write down certain things, and what they wrote down is exactly what God intended them to write down. And so the doctrine of inspiration tells us that the Bible is sort of a joint God and man project. Now, when it comes to manuscript evidence, as you kind of alluded to in your question, yeah, there's thousands of manuscripts of the Bible. And the Bible has a very well-known and well-studied manuscript tradition that not only have Christians studied, but even non-Christians have studied. And what's unique about the Bible's manuscript tradition is that it's been studied, and we know that there are variances, that there are differences between various copies and manuscripts of the Bible. But we acknowledge them, we point them out, people know where they are at. These manuscripts are available to be studied by scholars. Okay, so this is a very open project. And when it comes to these variances between different manuscripts of the Bible, through textual criticism, which is the study of how to reconcile these differences and figure out what the original reading was, through textual criticism, we can reconcile a lot of these variances. Okay. So the point I'm trying to make here is when it comes to the Bible and the manuscript tradition, it is something that is available for scholars to study. We know where the errors are. We know how to reconcile them. This is all information that's out into the public. Now, that's very different than what we have when it comes to the manuscript tradition of the Quran, and specifically the kind of claim that Muslims make about the Quran. And in fact, I would say that the claim that Muslims make about the Quran is a much more bolder and more audacious claim, and as a consequence, it requires almost a higher degree or higher certainty of the claim's accuracy. So, okay, well, so what do Muslims say about the Quran? Well, they say the Quran is not the inspired word of Allah, but rather they say the Quran is the literal words of Allah. In other words, they believe the Quran is a divine book that is uncreated, that has existed on clay tablets in heaven with Allah for all eternity past. And the contents of that Quran was dictated word for word by the angel Gabriel to a man named Muhammad between 610 and 632 AD. So again, the Muslim claim is that the Quran was communicated to Muhammad for about 22 years, between 610 and 632 AD. So notice there's no Muhammad's style or grammar or personality is supposed to be exhibited in the Quran, which is what we would say with regards to the Bible, right? Because with the Bible, human authors have contributed. They've used their style, their personality, their grammar to create what's in the Bible, along with the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. That's not what Muslims claim about the Quran. Because it is entirely written by Allah, there should be no sort of human component, no part of Muhammad's sort of personality should be present in there, okay, or his style or his grammar. Okay, so Muhammad allegedly, according to Islamic sources, memorized the Quran between 610 and 632 AD as the angel Gabriel was telling him the contents of it. In fact, the angel Gabriel told Muhammad, recite, recite, recite every time the angel appeared to Muhammad. In fact, the word Quran means recitation. Okay. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Muslims believe that the Quran has been transmitted from the time it was received by Muhammad to modern day, and that the Quran that Muslims have today is exactly the same as the Quran that Muhammad received from the angel Gabriel, and is which is also exactly the same as the Quran that exists in heaven as well. In fact, they basically say there's been no change in the Quran for the last 1400 years. And Surah 10:15, Surah 18:27, Surah 15:9, all these surahs, all these chapters and verses in the Quran talk about how nobody can change the Quran. It is an unchangeable text, and that Allah has sent it down, and He will protect it from being corrupted in any way. So the Muslim claim about the Quran is that what they read today is exactly the same thing that Allah has in heaven with Him on clay tablets that have existed forever. And there's been no copying errors, there are no variances, there's been no changes, there's been alterations, nothing. Okay? So I hope you can see how this is a much more bold and audacious claim they are making about the Quran. And so when you talk to a Muslim, that's kind of one of their arguments that they level against Christians is, oh, you Christians have the Bible, but it's been changed, it's been copied, but there's been mistakes put into it, right? But the Quran is free from corruption. Now, although that's what Muslims claim, according to their own Islamic sources, this is not at all what has happened in the history of the Quran. Okay? So let me just tell you some things that we know, again, from Islamic sources. These are not secular sources, these are not Christian sources. In fact, a lot of early Islam we only know from Islamic sources. Muslims have written these things to tell us about, say, Muhammad, to tell us about the Quran and other early events about early Islam. So what do we know about the creation of the Quran? Well, during the life of Muhammad, when he was receiving these revelations from the angel Gabriel, it was never written down. He was only told to recite it and to memorize it. In fact, It is alleged that he was illiterate. He couldn't read or write. So he memorized it, he told it to other people, and they memorized it. Now, he dies in 632 AD. And at that time, there was no written Quran. Now, maybe people have written parts of it here and there, but for the most part, it was not written. Now, as Islam begins to expand after Muhammad's death, there's a famous battle called the Battle of Yamama, where many Muslims who had memorized the Quran entirely were getting killed. And so the casualties in that battle were so severe that the Muslims started to fear, oh man, we're losing so many people who've memorized the Quran. If we continue in this fight, we're going to lose major portions of the Quran. So the first successor to Muhammad, his name was Abu Bakr, he orders, hey, you know what? We need to collect the Quran. We need to get this thing collected and written down in some way, because otherwise we're going to lose massive portions of it. And so he urges someone to basically collect it. So he goes to all the people who have memorized parts of it. Some people have written parts of the Quran on bits of leather, on stones, on bones and shoulder blades, on leaves, And so they collect it and they create basically a single document, all right? And they're like, okay, we finally now have the Quran. Okay, so I mean that whole process in itself just sounds a little bit sketchy. Like, okay, how precise was that process? But let's just say it was pretty precise. Okay, just give them the benefit of the doubt. So they take that now sort of kind of codified document and they stick it under their bed and they just kind of move on with life. Right. 20 years later, a bunch of Muslims from different provinces or different regions of the Islamic Empire get together. And they start reciting the Quran, and they realize they're reciting different versions of the Quran. And they're like, oh man, this is a massive problem. How is it that we all have different versions of the Quran, right? Because remember, they've been living in remote parts of the Islamic Empire, unconnected to one another. And so at that point, the third successor to Muhammad, his name is Uthman, he orders that the Quran be standardized, be codified. Okay, and so in 652, he commissions this guy to basically do this. He says, okay, I want you to get all the versions and try to create an authorized version in the dialect that that Muhammad spoke, and just make some sort of codified version. So in 652, they create a kind of the first authorized version of the Quran. And Uthman makes 5 copies of this new authorized version. He sends 5 copies out to different provinces of the Islamic Empire. And then he burns all the other variant versions of the Quran. And this comes from this historical fact comes from a guy named Bukhari. Now, Bukhari is a person who is a collector of hadith. Now, hadith are things that Muhammad said or approved of, okay? And Bukhari was one of the people who kind of collected all the sayings of Muhammad. And there's lots of people who do these collections. Bukhari is considered to be one of the most trustworthy of all of these collectors. And in his retelling of what happened, it says this is from Bukhari's, it's 4987, to just give you the reference, 4987, book 66, it's hadith number 9. Okay, and here's what it says. Uthman, remember he's the third successor to Muhammad, Uthman sent to every Muslim province 1 copy of what they had copied, in order that all other Quranic materials, whether written in fragmentary manuscripts or whole copies, be burnt. So all the variant readings of the Quran were destroyed. Muslims burnt them. Muslims were the first ones to burn Qurans, okay? And now, remember, he sent out 5 copies of this authorized version he created. By the way, we do not have any of those 5 copies, right? They don't exist. And if they do exist, no one has presented them to the public, to public scrutiny, or to scholarly investigation. Okay. By the way, even if we did have one of those 5 copies, that was this authorized version created in 652, basically it would be a version where all the variances were eliminated because they destroyed all the variances. Okay? So again, you're kind of seeing this history of how the Quran came to be, and already we have all kinds of questions as to how could this possibly be this like perfect document that was created by Allah and transmitted perfectly without any error or mistake. Now, back in the 7th century, the type of script that was used was a type of script that did not have what's called diacritical marks. So if you've seen modern Arabic, you'll see all these funky letters, and some of the letters will have little dots above or below, or little slashes and marks. And these diacritical marks, they're called, were not in existence in the Arabic script at the time the Quran was written. Diacritical marks were added to the Arabic language in the 8th, 9th, and 10th century. And what these marks do is they change the pronunciation and they change the meaning of the Quranic, of the Arabic language. So they didn't exist when the Quran was put down, and now they do exist in modern day Qurans. Okay, so again, they've had to add these things that again change pronunciation and change meaning. Now, the version that Muslims read today, at least in most parts of the world, is a version that was created by the Egyptian government. It's called the 1924 Royal Edition, or the Egyptian edition, and that was commissioned in 1924, and it's the one that's mostly used by Muslims today. Right? And again, it contains diacritical marks, but those were not in existence at the time the Quran was written. So that's kind of the history of how the Quran came to be, the present edition, and you could see just the history of how variances were probably introduced and eliminated, and so again, this just raises a whole bunch of questions and certainly a lot of doubts as to the claim that Muslims make about the Quran. Now, you were asking about some of these ancient copies of the Quran. Let me just mention the 6 most well-known of the ancient copies of the Quran. The first one's called the Topkapi manuscript. It's in Turkey. They estimate that it's dated around the mid-8th century, and it's considered one of the best copies we have. It uses a Kufic script, which has some dots, but not all the dots. And what's interesting about this text, which has been allowed to be studied by scholars, is that it differs from the modern Quran in about 2,000 or so different places. In other words, there's over 2,000 variances between the Topkapi manuscript and the modern Quran that Muslims have today. There's another manuscript called the Samarkand manuscript, which is in Uzbekistan. It's also mid-8th century about, and it only has 43 surahs. So there's 114 surahs in the Quran, 114 chapters. This manuscript copy only has 43 of the chapters. Okay, and again, lots of variances and differences compared to the modern Quran. Okay, a lot of grammatical errors as well, and a lot of Muslim scholars don't consider it to be reliable. There's the Ma'il manuscript that's in London. Also, I think it's late 8th century, also has numerous variances. There's a Petropolitanus manuscript, which is in the National Library in Paris. This one's 720 AD or so, 19% complete. So very small portion of the Quran is in there. But in that small portion, there's about 93 variances that have been detected relative to the modern Quran. There's the Al-Husseini manuscript, which is in Cairo, Egypt. This is about a 9th century manuscript, and I don't know that this has been studied as much. There's a lot of if you see a picture of it, it's gigantic. It's like, I don't know, this wide and probably this tall. Like 2 feet tall, 2 or 3 feet tall. It's huge pieces of paper, and there's these coverings over portions of the manuscript, so you can't study or check it very much. But perhaps the most interesting of all the manuscripts that's been discovered is the one that was discovered in 1975 in Sana'a, Yemen. And this story is kind of almost like a Dead Sea Scrolls story, although it doesn't fare well for the Muslim account of the Quran. But in 1975, there's some people who were doing some work on an old mosque in Sana'a, Yemen. And they kind of were tearing down a wall. They opened up the wall. They discovered some scrolls. They opened up the scrolls. They were written in Arabic, and they turned out to be Quranic material. Now, again, you know, the average person can't read this kind of material and study and know exactly what it is. So they hired an expert named Gerhard Puin, who I think is German, and he's an Orientalist, someone who specializes in these various scripts. And he was commissioned by the Yemenis government to study this material and give the results to the Yemenis government. And from what we know of his research, the Sana'a manuscript dates around 705 AD, so it's a very old manuscript. So 705, it's still like, you know, maybe just under 100 years after the alleged writing of the Quran. And we have detected about 1,000 manuscript variations between the Sana'a manuscript and the modern Quran today, right? Now, what's also very interesting about the Sana'a manuscript is that they discovered what's called palimpsests. And what this means is the material that was used to write on it people wrote down Quranic material, but then they washed it, they erased it, or at least they attempted to, and then they rewrote on top of it. And just by, you know, using your eyes, you can't see this underlying text that was written, but through ultraviolet light and through other imaging technologies that we have today, you can see the lower level, the lower layer of Quranic text. And what we've discovered is that there are about 63 verses that are in this sort of lower level, and there are about 73 variances between the lower level of the Quranic text and the upper level that you can read. Okay, so clearly there was an attempt to wash away the variances and to eliminate them in the more superficial text that you can read. Okay. And so, again, basically what you have then is a very nascent Quran, very early Quran that has a lot of corrections made to it that were washed off and then rewritten. And they think that the timing between the earlier lower level of the Quran and the higher level layer is about 10 or 15 years is their estimation. Anyways, all this, just to summarize here, is this. All the manuscripts, ancient manuscripts that we have of the Quran, also have variations, just like the Bible does, right? Now they have a fewer number of manuscripts, but they do have variations in them, which is contradictory to what most Muslims believe. And so this, of course, challenges the Muslim narrative about the Quran in significant ways. Yes, the Quran was codified in 652 AD by Uthman, but that's because he wiped away all the variances, right? And then even after codifying it, we have copies of the Quran that date up until today, which again also contain variances. So even by burning all the variances, they still have variances in them. Okay, and of course, none of these manuscripts are complete. None of them are 100% in agreement with one another, and certainly they don't agree with the modern 1924 version that is in existence today and read by Muslims. So there you have it. That's just probably a longer answer than you were looking for, but that's kind of what we know. And again, the main thing is that Muslims make a much bolder claim about the Quran and its manuscript history than we do about about the Bible. They claim there's no changes, no variances, no differences, no errors, and yet we see, according to their own sources, there were errors. And then when we have outside scholars do investigation, we also discover there's been a lot of variances and errors in it as well. So hope that kind of answers your question. All right, so let's go to the actually let's let's just keep going. We don't need to take a break since I think I took a little bit longer to answer that than we needed to. Let's go to the next question from Ray, and this is a question about intersex people.
Good morning. My name is Ray, and I had a question about LGBT nature, specifically the individuals who would fall under the intersex category. Now, if you're not very well versed on that, in short, these are people who may have extra or missing chromosomes and quite literally may have different physical anatomy. Now, that varies from time to time. They may actually have a penis and a vagina. And in many cases, when children are born in this circumstance, the parents and the doctors work together to either remove or sew up a situation, and they take hormones and they live as a specific gender. So how would you take this situation and advise someone who lives like this? Maybe they've already lived as a gender for many years, or maybe they've grown up and they felt, this is wrong. I should be living as a different way. How do they really choose when they were quite literally born with both? Do they just live with what they were assigned or what they feel? Do they avoid ever falling in love, having a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a husband or wife, just for fear of maybe accidentally having a homosexual relationship in the eyes of God? So I'd really like to know your opinion on this situation. And what would you advise someone who suffers from a condition like this so they can live in a way that's pleasing to God? Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Bye.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Ray. That's a tough question, and one that wow, just I mean, I can give an answer to this question, I guess, but I just feel like, yeah, this is just a situation where whoever's experiencing this, I just hope that whoever is in their life just shows a lot of compassion and love towards them, because they would most likely need that. So let me first unpack then what is intersex, because you said a couple of things in your question there that I'm not saying you did this intentionally, but that might mislead kind of our listeners as to what intersex is and isn't. So intersex, like you said, is a term it's a general term that's used for a variety of conditions where people are born with differences in their reproductive or sexual anatomy. Okay, and this is often, as you mentioned, I think you mentioned, as a result of chromosomal abnormalities or variations. So, as many people understand, men are typically born with XY chromosomes. Women are born with two X chromosomes. Okay, but sometimes, for example, there is a problem in the development of the embryo of the human being in early stages, and sometimes women are born missing or partially missing an X chromosome. So instead of having X chromosomes, they just have one X chromosome. In fact, this is referred to as Turner syndrome. It's a very well-known syndrome, and it's an intersex condition. And when women are born missing an X chromosome, they often have a shorter stature, delayed puberty, perhaps heart defects, delayed menstruation, or inability for their ovaries to fully develop. Okay, so you see there's abnormalities in their sexual or reproductive anatomy. Sometimes men also have an anomaly in their chromosomal variations. So instead of being born XY, they are born with an extra X chromosome. So they're XXY. This is a condition known as Klinefelter syndrome. And a lot of times when a guy is born with that extra X chromosome, they have symptoms like undescended testicles, or maybe they have some breast growth. Okay, oftentimes they're infertile. Okay, so yeah, these chromosomal abnormalities cause physical, anatomical, and physiological problems. Right. By the way, intersex conditions are not evidence that sex is not binary. Okay, a lot of times people who are advocating for transgenderism try to point to people who are intersex to say, see, they're neither male nor female, there's something else, or there's a third sex, or sex is on a spectrum. Okay, this is not the case. This is a faulty way to understand intersex conditions. Okay, intersex conditions represent variations within the categories of male and female. Okay, so sex is still binary. You still have a male and a female, but some males have intersex conditions and some females have intersex conditions, but they're still only male and female. Okay, and the vast majority of people who experience intersex conditions identify as male or female and not as transgender. Okay, but again, the transgender community oftentimes tries to co-opt the intersex community and use them as examples of somehow, evidence that sex is not binary. That's not the case. Now, in your question, Ray, you said something about how sometimes a person is born with both a penis and a vagina. And the reason why I want to draw attention to that part of your question, and again, I'm not saying you're trying to intentionally mislead people or anything like that, but the term intersex has replaced a more outdated term called hermaphrodite. And there's a reason why hermaphrodite has fallen out of favor among scholars, and here's the reason. Hermaphrodite means that a person would be born with both male sex organs and female sex organs, where both sex organs are fully functional and working. Now, this never happens in humans. It's impossible, I think, for a person to be born with both male and female genitalia and for both to be functional. Okay, and now some animals, I don't know, I forgot which ones, but some animals have that capacity, but no humans ever do. Okay, so it's never the case that a person is born with a fully functioning penis and a fully functioning vagina, and we're like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do because they're both? We got to pick one, and we could be completely off. Usually, it's they have a body that's very much either male or very much female, and they have some characteristics from the opposite sex as well, but they're not both fully functioning. Okay, you might have some functioning male parts, but non-functioning female, or fully functioning female parts and some non-functioning male parts, or characteristics, I should say. I should say parts, because that makes it sound more than it is. But in most cases, children who are born intersex, okay, are known by the physicians and even by the parents to be either male or female. Okay. Now, in some rare cases, and maybe this is what you're referring to, a child is born with ambiguous genitalia, which means it's not immediately obvious whether they are a boy or a girl. And in these instances, it's required that a specialist be brought in to the room where the child is born, or wherever they are, and to perform tests. And they can do a genetic test or hormone test, or do some imaging or ultrasound test to see what kind of organs are underneath. And by the way, according to Interact is the largest intersex organization, public advocacy organization in the US and maybe even the world. But according to Interact, they say that this only occurs, this ambiguous genitalia where we're not sure it's a boy or a girl, it only occurs in 0.05% of situations. So very, very rare. And even when that occurs, we could still come in and perform these tests to determine, okay, is it a boy or is it a girl? Okay. And again, if they're intersex, they're either a male with an intersex condition or they're a female with an intersex condition. So, having said all this, how would I advise an intersex person who fears that maybe they've identified with the wrong sex for whatever reason? Maybe their parents told them something, or maybe the doctor told them something and they've been wrong. If it was me, I would want to go and get, if I still wasn't sure, I would go and get the most advanced tests possible, right? I would get whatever genetic, hormonal tests, imaging tests that I could find, and then have an intersex specialist analyze the results. And then based on that objective data, based on the objective results, I would then choose to, I would then identify with whatever the objective results told me. So that's how I would handle that situation. Okay, yeah, good question. All right, so let's go to the next question from Joseph about apostasy, or putting apostates to death.
Hey Greg, hope you're doing well right now. My name is Joseph, calling from Atlanta. I wanted to reach out because I was watching a video about between a debate between a Muslim and a Christian, and the law of apostasy got brought up, and the Muslim objected with Deuteronomy 13 verse 6, saying that Deuteronomy 13:6, where it says that the same way in Islam that if a Muslim converts to Christianity, then the death penalty should be brought down upon him. The Bible also teaches the same way, and I wanted to hear kind of your response to that, without kind of saying that the Old Testament law no longer applies to us and is not applicable in modern day Christianity. And so I appreciate things that you do, appreciate your work, a huge fan. Thank you.
Okay, well, to answer that question, we first have to look at the passage that Joseph, you're referring to, Deuteronomy 13:6. So we got to see, well, what does that passage say? And then we also have to look and see, well, what does Islam say about apostasy? And see, is it really the case that they're both talking about the same kind of thing? So I got Deuteronomy here. Deuteronomy 13:6-10 says this: if your brother, your mother's son, or your son or daughter, or the wife you cherish, or your friend who is as your own soul, entice you secretly, saying, hey, let's go and serve other gods, whom neither you nor your fathers have known, of the gods of the peoples who are around you, near you, or far from you, from one end of the earth to the other end. You shall not yield to him, or listen to him, and your eyes shall not pity him, nor shall you spare or conceal him. But you shall surely kill him. Your hand shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterwards the hand of all the people. So you shall stone him to death, because he has sought to seduce you from the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Okay, so that's the passage that was cited. First of all, my quick impression about the passage and just a cursory reading is that it doesn't sound so much like a command to put apostates to death, right? Because an apostate would be somebody who was a Jew but then abandoned his religion, okay? But that's not exactly what the text says. It says if someone tries to secretly entice you to serve other gods, which, by the way, would be enticing you to break the first commandment, right? You shall have no other gods before me. So if someone tries to secretly entice you to serve other gods and break that first commandment, then you're to stone him to death, okay? But so just on a cursory reading, it sounds different than merely killing an apostate, all right? But notice the problem is more than just having another god, it's serving another god, okay? And this is a hint to, I think, what's the bigger problem with interpreting this passage as simply killing an apostate, okay? Because you probably know, if you've been around Standard Reason for any period of time, that one of the principles that we always teach when it comes to reading a Bible passage is this: never read a Bible verse, right? Greg always talks about this. Never try to figure out the meaning of a text in isolation from its context. Always try to read the stuff before and after. Read the context, because that tells you what the smaller unit of text is talking about. And so I think that this whole idea, when the passage says entice you to serve other gods, points to something in the context that helps to clarify why this passage isn't really about apostasy, okay? So let's just look at the chapter right before, chapter 12 of Deuteronomy. And actually, you only have to go 7 verses back. So even though I'm saying it's another chapter earlier, this is only 7 verses earlier. It helps you to understand something that's being talked about in Deuteronomy 13. So in Deuteronomy 12:31, it says this: "You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, because in worshiping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things that the Lord hates. They even," and here's what the Lord hates, "they even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods." Okay, so notice, in serving these other gods, this entails sacrificing your children by burning them in worship to this false god. Okay, so you see why the command to kill those people who are enticing you to serve another god is there. It's because if you were to go along with their enticement, that would entail you killing your son and your daughter, by the way, after they've also killed their son and daughter, okay, through sacrifice, through burning them. So therefore, notice, Deuteronomy 13, 6 through 10 isn't a command to kill apostates. Rather, it's a command to protect innocent children from getting killed through sacrifice, through worship to other gods. So that's why you're commanded to kill the person, because they're serving these other gods, sacrificing their kids, and now they're enticing you to sacrifice your kids as well. So again, once you read it in context, now it seems like, okay, this really isn't talking about killing an apostate. It's really about protecting children, your children, and the children of those people who are trying to entice you to serve other gods. Now, is this comparable to what we have in Islam? Is apostasy a capital crime in Islam? Such that you would have to kill somebody who is an apostate. And what do we mean by apostate? Well, the wrong way to answer that question would be to simply, Google it, or ask a Muslim friend, or go to a mosque here in the States and ask the imam there. I mean, maybe you can get a truthful answer, but merely asking people what they think or asking the internet isn't going to necessarily give you a truthful answer. Because what matters in Islam is authority. And so if you want to know whether a teaching, a behavior, a practice is truly a part of Islam and not just a part of what Muslim culture says, you need to look and see, what do authoritative sources about Islam say? And 3 key sources of authority in Islam are the Quran, the Hadith, the Sunnah. So the Quran are the literal words of Allah. That's the highest authority in Islam. The Hadith are the sayings of Muhammad, what he said or what he approved of, that have been written down. Okay, that's not as authoritative as what the Quran says, but it's still very important in Islam. And then the Sunnah. The Sunnah is the life example of Muhammad. So how he lived is authoritative for Muslims today. Now, is killing apostates taught in those 3 sources? Well, it turns out in the Quran, it's not explicitly taught. There's no definitive statements in the Quran where you have the command to kill an apostate present. Okay. Now, there are a number of Muslim theologians and Muslim apologists who do interpret some passages to infer that killing apostates is legitimate and commanded by Allah. So Abu al-Maududi, check out one of his books here. Abu al-Maududi is a well-known Islamic scholar, and he cites Surah 9, verses 11 through 12 as being a way to interpret the Quran to be promoting killing of apostates. There's a Pakistani scholar named Maulana Mufti Muhammad Shafi, and he cites Surah 2, verse 217, and says, according to what that says, you can infer that killing apostates is legit in Islam. But it's not super clear in the Quran, according to a lot of people that say, well, you can maybe infer it, but it's not explicit. But in the Hadith, you see very explicit commands to kill apostates in Islam. And remember, Hadith is what Muhammad said or approved of. Now, there's probably about 7 or so famous compilers of what Muhammad said or approved of. Okay, and remember I mentioned that in a previous question earlier today. Bukhari is considered to be the most trustworthy of all the compilers. Okay, so I'll mostly quote Bukhari here, but in Bukhari volume 9 number 17, Muhammad says this. Okay, so Muhammad, the most important prophet in Islam, says, "The blood of a Muslim who confesses that none has the right to be worshipped by Allah and that I am his messenger, okay, cannot be shed except in 3 cases." So Muhammad's here telling people, hey, look, you can't kill another Muslim except in these 3 situations. Number 1, in qisas, which is basically if somebody commits murder, they can be you can kill them for murdering another person. Okay. Number 2, a married person who commits illegal sexual intercourse. And number 3, the one who reverts from Islam and leaves the Muslims. So Muhammad says you can't kill a Muslim unless they commit murder, have commit adultery, or leave Islam. Now, by the way, this is recorded in another collection of hadith by a guy named Muslim, al-Muslim. And in his hadith collection, book 16, number 4152, it's almost the same quote from Muhammad. He said it's not permissible to take the life of a Muslim except in 3 cases: a married adulterer, a life for life, and a deserter of his din, of Islam, who abandons the community. There's another one in another Bukhari passage, volume 9, number 57. Some people are talking about these atheists that were captured, and Ali, who was the 4th successor to Muhammad, he kills them by burning them. And Ibn Abbas, this other guy, says, hey, I would not have burnt them. I don't think that's right. That's the way Allah punishes people. Ali says, I would have killed them according to the way Muhammad would kill them. And then he quotes Muhammad. And the quote is from Muhammad, whoever changes his Islamic religion, then kill him. So again, you have the several quotes from Muhammad himself saying that this is the way apostates from Islam should be treated. By the way, if you go and look at the 4 schools of jurisprudence that are found in Islam today, I think all 4 of them affirm that apostasy is a capital crime. So, for example, the Hanbali school says this: in the opinion of Imam Ahmed ibn Hanbal, any adult and rational man or woman who renounces Islam and chooses kufr should be given a 3-day period to repent. The person who does not repent should be executed. Okay, pretty straightforward. A second school of jurisprudence, the school of Malik, it says this: Malik has reported that the apostle of God, who's Muhammad, declared, whoever changes his religion should be executed. So basically, the school of Malik is quoting that Bukhari hadith that I quoted to you earlier. And Malik said this about the tradition: as far as we can understand, this command of the Prophet means that the person who has left Islam and publicly chooses to follow another way should be requested to repent. If he repents, good. Otherwise, he should be executed. So, anyways, I mean, we can go on and on, look at other schools of jurisprudence. You can get the book, The Life of Muhammad, which is a biography of Muhammad, written by Ibn Ishaq. And in his biography, you see Muhammad when he conquers Mecca with 10,000 soldiers. He orders a number of people who are apostate to be executed. So he orders their assassination. So again, that's part of his biography. Again, created by Muslims, given to the world so we can understand who Muhammad was. Okay. So all this to say, to answer, Joseph, your question, no, I do not believe Deuteronomy 13 is the same as the law to kill apostates in Islam. Because, as I mentioned, the Deuteronomy passage is not about killing apostates, right? But it's about killing people who try to seduce you to serve other gods, which entails sacrificing your children and their children to a false god in fire. Okay, whereas the laws against apostasy in Islam do warrant execution. Anybody who abandons their faith. And I know you made mention of this in your question, but again, the Deuteronomy command, even the one to kill the person who tries to seduce you to serve another god, that's part of the 613 commands of the Mosaic Law, which, according to standard Christian theology, this is those commands are no longer binding on the New Testament believer because Christ fulfilled the requirements of the Mosaic Law and established a new covenant in his blood, the covenant of grace. So I mentioned that to you because that Deuteronomy passage, although it's no longer binding on the New Testament believer, in Islam, the position on apostasy has not changed. There's no indication that the command to kill apostates has been annulled or abrogated. So it would still be a binding command in Islam. Okay, there you have that. Hope that helps you there. And then let's see, we got just a few minutes. So what I'm going to do is go to a question that was sent in to hashtag #STRask. And so normally, Greg and Amy will answer those questions, but they asked me to address this. And so it was sent in through a computer. So I'll just read to you the question. And part of the reason why I'm just going to jump to this one is because it's about Pride Month, and we're just about entering Pride Month here in June. And so this question is from Winnipeggers Are the Best. Okay, so here's the question. Pride Month is coming. How do we respond to sports teams, coffee shops, etc., that are online or in person, when we see this narrative propagated? And then it says here, something winsome and something rhetorical, please. Okay, so I guess he wants something winsome and rhetorical. Okay, I appreciate that. Yeah, this is a great question because yes, Pride Month is coming in June. At least it's Pride Month in the States. I don't know if it's everywhere, but well, let me give you my quick answer here because we just have a few minutes, and maybe my answer isn't going to be super popular or emotionally satisfying, but here's how I would advise you to handle Pride Month when you see it propagated, and that is this: when you can, just ignore it. I mean, I actually don't think there's any need to create unnecessary tension, make a scene, or start a fight, right? I mean, if you walk into a store and you see a pride flag, and if it doesn't affect you, then just move on, right? If you go to Starbucks to get a cup of coffee and they have pride flags, just get your coffee and then leave. Move on. Like, honestly, that's how I respond to the majority of Pride Month that's propagated. I see it and I ignore it and I just move on. By the way, my attitude, first of all, is I'm not surprised that people are celebrating Pride Month, right? I mean, it makes sense, right? We live in a secular culture, right? We live in a secular world that's run by secular people. And of course, they're going to celebrate sin. I mean, that's not surprising to me, right? If you think about the passage in 1 John 5 where he says, we are children of God and the whole world is under the control of the evil one. Yeah, well, that makes sense. It's no surprise then that secular culture run by the evil one celebrates things that are contrary to God. All right. Now, if that's not sufficient for you, if you're like, well, that's not enough, Alan, I want to do something more. Like, what's the next level? Okay, well, if it makes you feel any better, then here's the next level of response, and that is don't patronize that shop. Don't go and buy stuff at that store or that restaurant or the coffee shop. In other words, if you see a pride flag, don't spend your money there. Rather, find stores, and there's plenty of them, that don't celebrate Pride Month, and then spend your dollars there, right? So, I mean, again, that's my general approach when it comes to the Pride Month stuff. I just ignore it, or if I really want to like make a statement, I guess I would probably not shop in that location. And again, that might not be super satisfying to you, but that's my take. Now, I guess those are the situations where it's kind of more passive, but I could imagine that there might be some situations where it might be more asserted at you. Like, for example, maybe a work setting or maybe a social setting where you're asked to participate in it in some way, like wear a flag or say something, I don't know. In that case, I'd say my policy would be this: don't participate. So if you can't just ignore it and they're asking you to participate, don't participate. Okay? And if I was asked to participate, I would just simply decline, even if that meant some sort of negative outcome. Although I think people sometimes, well, this is just a guess, but my guess is that sometimes people exaggerate the likelihood that something negative is always going to come about. I've had many people tell me that they've just simply asked if they could not participate, and it didn't cause any ruckus at work or, at school or wherever it was. So something as simple as simply saying, hey, would you mind asking someone else to do the job? Let's say they ask you to do something. Hey, would you mind someone else doing that? Or maybe saying, I don't think I'd be the best person for that job. So sometimes just redirecting that request to participate in Pride Month to somebody else is all that's needed to avert a problem. Okay. I suppose if they persist in asking you to participate or celebrate or say something or whatever, then you might get more aggressive in your response by saying something like, hey, you know what? I feel like I can't do that because it violates my conscience. Or, if it's at work, I think Greg's mentioned this before. He says, hey, why do I have to adopt your politics in order to work here? So again, these are just some ideas of things that you can say in response to those situations. Okay. So anyways, I hope that helps. Again, in most cases, you could probably ignore it, and that should help you with that. All right. Hey, thanks for all your questions. I've enjoyed being able to be here with you guys today. Thanks for your thoughtful questions, and my prayer is that you'll be able to serve Jesus as an ambassador for him this week. Thanks a lot. Talk to you next time.